Imagine a land of breathtaking landscapes, thriving nations, and deeply rooted traditions, only to be transformed forever by the arrival of strangers. The story of how the United States colonized North America is one marked by dramatic landscapes, cultural diversity, and a sweeping transformation that changed the course of history. From coastal shorelines to alpine mountains and arid deserts, this vast land was once home to hundreds, if not thousands, of distinct Native American tribes. These were nations in their own right, with rich histories, traditions, and profound connections to the land. Yet, the arrival of Europeans set in motion a series of events that led to the dispossession of indigenous peoples and the creation of a new empire, the United States of America. The Louisiana Purchase, a turning point. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase became a pivotal moment in the expansion of the United States. Two American diplomats in Paris finalized a deal that effectively doubled the country's size for $15 million. This purchase, however, was not as straightforward as it appeared. What the United States acquired from France was not the land itself but imperial rights, the claim to colonize and govern the vast territories west of the Mississippi River. France, in reality, did not own this land. It was the ancestral home of numerous Native American tribes. For the United States to solidify control over this territory, they needed to obtain it from the indigenous peoples who had lived there for millennia. At the time, the U.S. government aimed to differentiate itself from the imperial practices of European powers by adopting a supposedly just and humane approach to Indian affairs. President George Washington emphasized principles of justice and humanity, proposing that land acquisitions would occur through negotiated treaties rather than conquest. Treaties and their troubled legacy. In theory, treaties offered a fair method for transferring land ownership. The U.S. government pledged to compensate native tribes with food, farming equipment, cash, and other resources in exchange for their land. Initially, this transactional process seemed peaceful, with settlers moving into new territories under formal agreements. However, many tribes resisted these arrangements. For them, the land was sacred, tied to their identity, culture, and survival. Farming tools or monetary compensation could not replace what they would lose. When tribes refused to sell or vacate their lands, the ideals of justice and humanity quickly eroded, giving way to coercion, manipulation, and violence. One striking example is the conflict with tribes near the Great Lakes. These tribes sought to establish a boundary marked by a river, declaring that the United States should not cross into their territory. The U.S. government ignored this demand, leading to a series of wars. Though the tribes initially won 2 battles, the U.S. ultimately triumphed in a third conflict and forced them to sign a treaty ceding much of present-day Ohio. Broken promises and forced relocations. The story repeated itself across the continent. When the Muskogee Nation in present-day Alabama reluctantly agreed to sell part of their land under assurances that they could keep the rest, white settlers soon encroached on their remaining territory. Despite no treaty authorizing this, the Muskogee were eventually forced off their ancestral lands by the U.S. military. Elsewhere, tribes were subjected to underhanded tactics. Leaders were often coerced into signing treaties under duress, intoxicated during negotiations, or replaced by individuals willing to comply with U.S. demands. In some cases, treaties were blatantly disregarded when new opportunities arose, such as the discovery of gold in lands held by the Sioux and Arapaho. Despite a treaty recognizing their ownership, the U.S. government redrew boundaries and allowed settlers to exploit the region. The expansionist tide. The westward expansion of the United States was relentless. By the mid-19th century, the government had signed 368 treaties with Native American tribes, almost all of which led to the displacement of indigenous peoples. These agreements, often presented as legal and just, masked a campaign of imperial conquest. As settlers moved into new territories, they established control over lands wrested from their original inhabitants. This process was supported by a legal framework that legitimized the expropriation of native lands, often under the guise of progress and civilization. The government not only facilitated these expansions but also provided military support to enforce its claims when resistance arose. Resistance and resilience. Despite the overwhelming odds, many tribes resisted U.S. encroachment. The Seminole Wars in Florida, for example, demonstrated the fierce determination of native peoples to defend their lands. Similarly, the Sioux and Arapaho fought and defeated U.S. forces multiple times, forcing the government to acknowledge their territorial rights in a treaty. However, such victories were often short-lived. as the U.S. would later renege on its agreements when it suited its interests. The aftermath of displacement. The consequences of this displacement were profound. Tribes were often relocated to unfamiliar and inhospitable regions, stripping them of their traditional ways of life and access to vital resources. The forced migrations, such as the infamous Trail of Tears, resulted in immense suffering and loss of life. This systemic dispossession was not merely a series of isolated incidents, but a deliberate strategy to transform the North American continent into a space dominated by European American settlers. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had established control over nearly all the land within its borders, reshaping the continent in its image. The forced migrations and policies of the 19th century set a precedent for governmental control over indigenous sovereignty, which continues to shape the relationship between native nations and the U.S. government today. The economic motives behind removal. The underlying motivation for the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and subsequent policies was not simply a clash of cultures or a desire to civilize Native Americans, as some proponents claimed. It was a land grab fueled by economic ambitions. By the early 19th century, the American South had become the epicenter of the global cotton industry, often referred to as King Cotton. The fertile lands occupied by the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations were prime real estate for this booming agricultural economy. The introduction of the cotton gin had revolutionized production, increasing demand for both land and enslaved labor. The removal of Native Americans from their territories allowed white settlers to establish vast plantations, often worked by enslaved African Americans, perpetuating a brutal system of exploitation. The legal and political machinery. The Indian Removal Act framed the process as voluntary, but the coercive tactics employed by the government revealed its true nature. Treaties were often signed under duress, with tribal leaders misled, bribed, or outright ignored. The Treaty of New U.S.A., which ceded all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi to the U.S. government, is a stark example. Signed in 1835 by a small faction of the Cherokee people who had no legitimate authority to represent the tribe, it was ratified despite widespread Cherokee opposition, including protests from their principal chief, John Ross. The U.S. government, through both military force and bureaucratic decrees, systematically dismantled the autonomy of native nations. State laws, such as those passed in Georgia, criminalized indigenous governance, culture, and even the presence of native people on their own land. The human cost of the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was more than a journey. It was a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions. Families were uprooted, often with little notice, and forced to abandon their homes, livestock, and possessions. The march, stretching over 1,000 miles, exposed them to harsh weather, starvation, and disease. Eyewitness accounts describe the harrowing conditions. Some spoke of rivers swollen with ice, where individuals died attempting to cross. Others recounted burial parties every morning for those who had succumbed to the night's cold. The human toll extended beyond the immediate loss of life. Cultural practices were disrupted, sacred sites abandoned, and entire communities fragmented. The aftermath in Indian Territory. The land designated as Indian Territory, primarily in present-day Oklahoma, was presented as a permanent solution, a place where Native Americans could rebuild their lives without interference. However, this promise, like so many others, was fleeting. The U.S. government reneged on its guarantees of sovereignty and land protection as westward expansion and the discovery of valuable resources in Indian Territory led to further encroachments. The Dawes Act of 1887 dismantled communal landholdings, dividing them into individual allotments to be distributed to native families, with the surplus sold to white settlers. This policy eroded tribal cohesion and resulted in the loss of millions of acres of land. Cultural resilience and resistance. Despite these immense challenges, Native American tribes demonstrated remarkable resilience. They rebuilt communities, preserved languages, and sustained cultural practices in the face of adversity. Legal battles continued, with tribes leveraging the U.S. legal system to assert their rights. Landmark cases such as Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, and later decisions laid the groundwork for modern tribal sovereignty. The Cherokee Nation, for instance, established a government modeled on the U.S. Constitution and maintained its schools and institutions, becoming a beacon of resilience and self-determination. Today, many tribes are reclaiming their histories and strengthening their cultural identities, often blending traditional knowledge with contemporary innovations. Long-term impacts on Native American communities. The policies of removal and assimilation have left a lasting legacy. Many Native communities face socio-economic challenges, including poverty, limited access to education, and healthcare disparities. Yet, these issues are not the result of inherent deficiencies but are deeply rooted in centuries of systemic marginalization. The removal policies also disrupted ecological balances. Many tribes had developed sustainable relationships with their environments over millennia. The forced relocation to unfamiliar territories disrupted these practices, contributing to the environmental degradation that often accompanied settler expansion. Reclaiming history. The story of Indian removal is increasingly being revisited and reframed in historical narratives. Museums, educational institutions, and Native communities are working to ensure that these events are not forgotten or sanitized. Acknowledging this history is not merely an academic exercise but a step toward addressing its ongoing consequences. Land acknowledgements, policy reforms, and efforts to strengthen tribal sovereignty are part of a broader movement toward reconciliation and justice. A legacy of lessons. The Trail of Tears and the broader history of Native American displacement hold crucial lessons about the dangers of unchecked power, the consequences of systemic discrimination, and the resilience of marginalized communities. These stories challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths and to recognize the humanity and contributions of all peoples. In understanding this chapter of history, we are reminded of the importance of protecting human rights, respecting cultural diversity, and ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. The Trail of Tears is not merely a historical event. It is a call to action for a more just and equitable future.